Hello everyone, Tuzzenbox here, and I am here with a guide on how to score better in Amplitude. Now, I've been playing Amplitude since the frequency days, and I've spent a lot of time, getting better at the game, going for high scores, all that jazz. Um, and I was recently inspired to make this video thanks to a few community members who are doing everything they can to keep this game alive. So I was kind of pushed to kind of share what I know and techniques that I've utilized in the past to get high scores and pass them along to everyone else. So hopefully, you can get a thing or two from these videos and watch your scores hopefully skyrocket. Let's go. Okay, so the first thing that I am going to tell everyone, it's a very simple tip, and that is to play on super difficulty. Now, I understand that, there are some difficult songs that are a bit harder to beat on super as opposed to expert or advanced, but if you want to get the most score potential, you're going to have to play on super. Despite there being a rather big difficulty jump going from expert to super, you're going to want to maximize all the practice you can get in super so you can take advantage of the higher score ceiling. Yes, I know that certain songs are very difficult on super, so that actually brings me to the next tip that I have for you guys. The second tip that I have for you is to replay songs. Now, back when I played this game daily, I can say that I would spend hours at a time on one single song. Now, what this does for you is it allows you to begin memorizing tricky parts of a song, and as you get more comfortable with playing through a song, you can then start to experiment with different paths, hopefully finding some more multipliers, which will, in the long run, end up increasing your score. Sometimes it can take hours, maybe even days to get really good at a song, but once you start getting that repetition and you get that muscle memory going, you're going to find yourself getting further and further into a song, getting higher and higher scores, and, eventually making your way up to elite paths. So the next tip that I'm going to give you is going to be for songs where you're more than comfortable finishing on super difficulty, and that is to actually repeatedly play each song to the end. Now, in doing this, you're getting an idea of the full flow of the song, and also you're going to be able to keep an eye out for any type of tricks or surprises at the end of a song. So say you're restarting, for example, a third of the way into a song or halfway into a song. Once you eventually get that portion of the song down pat and you have your path memorized, you're going to have no idea what to do for the remainder of that song. So constantly replaying the song from start to finish is going to give you an idea of where you may want to go in the song, hopefully find some multipliers, and once you get an idea for the entire flow of the song, you can then start to set your path for the entire song. Okay, so the fourth tip that I have for you guys is to stop simply left or right seeking. A lot of times I see players who are either new to super or perhaps they're unfamiliar with a good path for a song. They just simply seek left or right in one direction for long periods of time. Now, this is bad for a few reasons. The first reason being is that it is very likely that you are going to miss out on a multiplier that you don't know is coming. The second reason is if you're constantly seeking in one direction, you could be missing out on tracks with much more points than you would get by simply following a simple left or right pattern. And the third reason, and I'll go into this in a little more detail later, is you want to be able to manipulate your captures so that you can maximize your points on a certain track. What I'm going to be doing over the next couple of steps is showing you some examples as to why simple left to right seeking is bad and what you need to be doing to maximize your scores. Alright, so here we are going to take a look at a player who is very proficient at hitting notes, but there are a number of issues with the route that he is taking. We're going to break down and analyze what he's doing wrong, and we're going to take a look at a much more idealized path, compare the scores, so you can really get a clear idea as to what needs to be changed when you play in this way. Okay, so as you can see here at the end of the first section of this song, this player had a score of 588 points. When we compare this to the current elite run for this particular song, we can see that not only do we have almost 400 more points, but we also picked up an extra multiplier along the way. So what are the differences between these two routes? Well, I'll show you. Now, this next tip, it's actually very simple, but it's a lot of times very overlooked, and that's to simply change the track that you start on. There isn't really a whole lot to add to this. A lot of times simply just changing the track that you start on can result in a much better path for you in the long run. And also, if you look at many of the current elite and high score videos, many of them actually do not start on the starting track for one reason or another. The next two tips that I'm going to give you, they're kind of going to go hand in hand because they both revolve around kind of looking away from where you currently are. Tip 6 is look ahead to find multipliers. Now, in this clip, we're going to take a look at a player who is just simply seeking left and capturing what's available. Now, as you can see, there's a very early base multiplier that this player did not get simply because he wasn't looking ahead. Now, in this case, this is a very simple fix. You can easily restart the song and adjust your path to get that multiplier. However, you may find instances where you're much further into a song and simply restarting at this point is not an option. So you really want to make sure that you're doing your best to look ahead at other tracks to see if there are any multipliers coming. Now, sometimes it can be difficult to keep an eye out for the multipliers. The multipliers themselves aren't exactly easily visible, and sometimes the curvature of the highway can be a bit of a nuisance. But that second point is something that we're going to reference very shortly. However, I have seen instances where people have missed an easy multiplier simply because they weren't looking a measure or two ahead. So, while you're playing, make sure you try to keep an eye out for any multipliers, and if you see a multiplier, plan ahead. Avoid capturing that track until you know you can get the multiplier. And keep this in mind, it's usually not a great idea to break your streak to get a multiplier. There are some very rare occasions where a breaking streak is ideal. So if you're going to break the streak to get a multiplier, simply ignore the multiplier and get it on your next run. Okay, so staying with the idea of looking ahead at other tracks, tip number 7 is to look ahead for tracks with more notes. Now, you're all familiar with the game of Amplitude, so I don't need to tell you that more notes equals more points. In this example here, you see someone once again using a simple one direction seek, and they're going to miss out on a lot of points simply because they're capturing low scoring tracks. It's a little difficult to see in this particular example. In this instance, the player would have been better off skipping the vocal tracks, and understandably it's a little hard to see in this situation, but either of the drum tracks would have provided this player with some more points overall. And then you'll also see, instead of capturing the humongous bass track, he decided to stay on the drum tracks for a couple extra measures. And if we move forward just a little bit, The curvature makes it difficult, but as you can probably see, the right synth is actually worth more points than the left synth. So the player could have captured that to get a few more points. And if we keep going here, instead of capturing the vocals here, the player would have been much better off capturing the drums instead. And just a quick tip, in a lot of songs you generally want to stay away from the vocals because in most cases they don't provide you with as many points. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a bit sidetracked and kind of go off on a tangent here and discuss something that's very technical. Now this does require a deep understanding of the game of Amplitude, so if you don't feel as though you're quite at that level, feel free to skip forward to the next section of the video. I'll leave a timestamp here so you can get over to the next tip. In super difficulty, tracks normally respawn in 7 measures, meaning if you start a song and capture a track on measure 2, you will see it again at the beginning of measure 10. This means that if there are no gaps in any other instruments, you won't be able to start that track again until measure 11, 8 bars later. So what this means is that you will have to capture 4 other instruments before you can get back to that starting instrument. The reason I bring this up is because in the example of Perfect Brain during the breakdown section, we have this bass track that is worth a large number of points and we have access to it for a total of 16 measures. What this means is that we are able to capture this measure twice before we lose access to those points. What we have to do is capture that track no more than 6 measures into the breakdown section to make sure that the bass has time to respawn and we can get to that bass a second time to maximize our score. Now in this example, we see that this player did not capture the bass track until halfway through the breakdown. This means that after 4 more captures, we will not be able to get back onto that bass track. So in this case, we want to make sure that we capture that bass track either on measures 1 and 2 of the breakdown, 3 and 4, or 5 and 6. This way we're guaranteeing that we're able to get the bass a second time and really improve our score. Okay, this next tip is actually extremely important when it comes to getting really high scores, and that is to memorize where multiplies are. Now, the way most people go about doing this is to simply replay the song over and over again. Hope they stumble across the multiplier and try to remember where that multiplier is and come back to it on another run. But honestly, the best way to do it would probably be to study the elite videos to see exactly where the multipliers are. This takes the guesswork out of trying to find where the multipliers are and even trying to guess how many multipliers are in a song. And this also makes it much easier to plan your own path around where the multipliers are. Alright, now tip number 9 is extremely vital, and yet many players are not utilizing this correctly, and that is to use your multipliers correctly. Now I want to go back to the previous example of this person playing Dialetect, and we notice at the start he immediately uses his multiplier. The first thing to keep in mind is that a multiplier by default will last exactly 5 measures. What this means is if you use a multiplier at the beginning of your first measure of a capture, you'll actually be able to capture 3 measures at 2 bars apiece, meaning that technically it'll last 6 measures in that case. However, if you use your multiplier correctly, you can actually capture a 4th measure, and the way to do that is to use the multiplier during a 2nd measure of a capture. Now if we look at the player on the right, we see him activate his multiplier on the first measure of a capture. And the player on the left will run through the exact same path, except he'll use the multiplier on the second measure. Once we get to the end of the 4th measure for the player on the left, we'll see that his score is significantly higher than the player on the right. Another thing to keep in mind is that it is not enough to simply use the multiplier on the second measure of a capture. If after 5 measures you have not started the 4th capture, then the multiplier will run out. Here is an example of what I'm talking about. The player on the right uses his multiplier as soon as the 2nd measure starts, but the player on the left uses his multiplier further into the 2nd measure. And once we get to the end of the left player's 4th measure, once again we'll see that his multiplier lasted for a 4th capture, thereby giving him a significantly higher score. Now, ideally you want to use your multiplier as late into a measure as you can, just to simply guarantee that you'll get the 4 captures. However, this isn't always necessary. If we look at this path for Red Giant, we see that this multiplier is used very early on in the 2nd measure. Now, since we start the 4th measure before the 5 measures of the multiplier running out, we're able to get that 4th capture with the multiplier still active. I know that sounds a bit confusing, but that's kind of the best way that I can explain it right now. Another thing I want to go over is something that I'm asked every so often, and that's how to use a multiplier during very complex patterns. For me, I just simply press the X button at the same time as I press either a right note or a middle note. That way it's 2 button presses, but it feels like just one input. You're just, kind of squeezing the controller. There are a few exceptions to this, and I don't really have much else to say on, how to really do it. One thing I can recommend is to consider using your multiplier a capture earlier. This way, if the capture before the complex part is simpler, perhaps you could find a spot to use the multiplier there, and that way still keep your score pretty high. Other than that, there are a number of variables that can go into finding the right spot to use a multiplier. For example, here, if you look at this $tech path, you can see there's a gap in the synth here where I use the multiplier, and you would think that since I'm using it so early, there's a chance that I may not give the 4th capture. However, given my knowledge of the song, I know that I can activate the multiplier early here and still get the 4th capture because the multiplier won't run out before the 4th measure starts. Another part of using your multiplier correctly is to use it when your score multiplier is maxed. If you miss a track, a lot of people use the multiplier to counteract the missed points for losing their ×4 multiplier. However, this is not recommended. If you use a multiplier at ×2, you're going to be missing out on a lot of points because when you use a multiplier, you should be multiplying everything by 8 instead of by 2, and then 4, and then 6 while you build up your multiplier again. Also, and this may sound a little crazy, if you go to use a multiplier and you miss, I would strongly recommend simply restarting the song. Again, you want to make sure that you're getting the most out of your multiplier, and missing just as you use it not only messes up the total score, but it also can affect how long it will last. Now, I'm sure if I'm missing anything about multipliers, my future self who is putting this video together will give us a reminder. Tip number 10. Master transfers. Now, there's a lot that goes into a transfer, believe it or not. You have to make sure that you finish the track that you're on. You have to make sure that you transfer to the appropriate track, which usually is just one seek over. And you have to make sure that you begin the next measure perfectly. Otherwise, if you mess any of that up, you miss. Now, I'm simplifying this, but there's actually a lot more that goes into a transfer. For example, you may find yourself needing to skip over a track, whether you're getting a multiplier or simply following a path that'll give you more points. Instead of doing a double transfer one direction, sometimes it's possible to transfer in the opposite direction. What I mean is, if your track is to the left and there's a track in between, try transferring to the right. And this way it's just one seek instead of two, so it's a simpler transfer. In theory, that is. When you transfer this way, it does require you to use your perifs. That's short for peripherals. So you'll have to be looking ahead at what's coming, which means you'll be taking your eyes away from what you're playing. So a bit of either memory or, in some cases, even dumb luck is required. To help kind of put things into perspective, I'm going to give you an example of two players playing on Super Spatial. And the player on the left is using simpler one-seek transfers, whereas the player on the right is using double transfers. Now, as you can see, the end result is exactly the same. It's the exact same path with the exact same score. However, one player finds it more comfortable to transfer in the opposite direction, and therefore having to take their eyes off of what's coming, or just simply memorizing what's coming in the next measure. And the second player can easily keep an eye on where he's at and where he's going, but makes the transfers a bit more difficult by skipping over a track in between. Sometimes there will be some situations where you have to do a double transfer. You can't do the opposite transfer in the opposite direction. There's a couple of techniques that you can try out to tackle these tricky transfers. The first is to basically double tap left or right as quickly as you can. One thing you can do to practice this when you're not playing is to just simply double tap left or right on your D-pad, just to see how quickly you can press the buttons. The quicker you can double tap the D-pad, the better your chances are of nailing those tricky transfers. The second technique you can try is to use either of the analog sticks to do a second transfer. So what you'll do is you'll use the D-pad for one transfer, and you'll use the analog sticks for a second move. As complex as that sounds, there's actually another layer of complexity. This technique is guaranteed to work when there is not a gap between where you're trying to go and where you are. Now, let's say there is a gap between two of the instruments. For example, this extremely tight transfer in Dreamer, where we have to go from the drums to skip over a track to get to bass and then get to the guitar. So there is a very specific way we have to do the double transfer. We have to hit the D-pad first to skip over the drum track, land on bass, and then use the right analog stick to switch us over once again to get over to guitar. If we do it in the opposite direction, if we hit the right analog stick first, on default controls, the right analog stick is move, so we'll actually move over onto the right drums. And then if we hit right on the D-pad, it's only going to take us to bass, and that's not where we want to be. Now, one way to circumvent this is to reach your thumb over and hit the left analog stick instead. With default controls, the left analog stick is also seek, so if we use that in conjunction with the D-pad, we can guarantee that we can make the double transfer despite the fact that there's an empty track in between. Another trick you can use to try to nail really tight transfers is to consider using the face buttons. Let's say, for example, you are on a track and it's going to end on a middle note, and the track that you're going to transfer to also starts on a middle note. However, the time between both of those tracks is very small. What you can try to do is hit the last note of the first capture with R1, and after you transfer to the next track, use triangle to hit the next note. This way you don't have to worry about tapping the same button really quickly in succession with a transfer command in between. Of course, those button inputs are only for default control, so if you have to make adjustments for the appropriate control style that you play with, then sorry, you're on your own. Alright, I think I spent enough time on transfers, but this will transition perfectly into tip 11, and that is to keep your streak. And keeping your streak is obviously very important because it maximizes the score that you get with each capture. If you miss, you then miss out on quite a few points because you then have to build your multiplier back up from ×1 to ×4, as I mentioned when I went over how to use multipliers properly. To show you how important keeping your streak is, we have an example of two players going through Assault on Psycho Fortress, a song that's known for its very high score ceiling. Now, the player on the left will play every part perfectly here, and the player on the right makes a couple mistakes. As you can see, he misses on the vocals here, and if we pay attention to the score, we're going to see that there's actually a difference of 153 points, and that's just the result of one single miss. Now if we continue forward a bit more, this is going to piggyback off of missing during the multiplier. We can see that the player on the right misses while activating his multiplier, and at the end of the multiplier phrase, once he finally gets his multiplier back up, the player on the right is going to be down another 480 points. So altogether he is 633 points off of the best possible score, and he's only missed twice in that section. Another side effect of missing tracks is that if you're following a very specific path, if you miss, it can sometimes make that transfer to another track more difficult, because a track that normally would not be spawned is now sitting right in between where you are and where you need to go. Now, let's just say that you're not 100% comfortable with nailing those tricky tracks and then also transferring from them. The good thing about playing on Super is that if there's one very difficult track, 9 times out of 10 you will always have another easier track to fall back on. Wait. Did he just say 9 times out of 10 you always have a track to Bruh. So it may be a better choice for you to stay off of those complex tracks and stay on something simpler, just so you can keep your ×4 multiplier. Because going for something complex and missing is a lot worse than staying on something that's not worth as many points, but still maximizing your multiplier. Now do keep in mind that this isn't always possible. For example, Digital Paralysis has a very complex section with a number of very tricky tracks that can be difficult. For this, you just kind of have to roll with the punches and make your way to the end of that section. But once you get clear of that section, there's generally only one difficult track, and that's one of the drum tracks. Everything else you should be able to get at an average or above average skill level. Now, let's say you have a pretty good path and you get to one section of the song where the highway curves to a point where you can hardly see, or you really can't see at all. Tip number 12 is another simple one, is to simply start on another portion of the highway. And what I mean by that is, if you play in freak mode, you'll notice that each of the 6 instruments are repeated a total of 3 times. So if you start on bass on one portion of the highway, you can just simply choose a different bass track to start on, and what that'll do is throughout the course of the song it'll change the angle of the curvature, so when you get to that section that's giving you some difficulty with visibility, that should help alleviate some of the problems, if not completely eliminate it for you, and make it so that you can easily see what's coming up next. Okay, so finally I bring you to the last tip of this video. I know, it took long enough, right? Tip 13 is simply memorize the elite paths. Now, as most of you know, I have a playlist on my channel of all of the best recorded scores on YouTube. And when it comes to getting points, these are literally the best option for maximizing your scores. Now, I do understand that there is this sort of pride when, you chart your own path, you get your own high score, that you have that personal pride that you did all that 100% on your own. But it's going to come to a point where if you get good enough, you're going to find out that there's going to be a score ceiling that you're going to hit, and without thoroughly studying and even memorizing the elite paths, you're going to find yourself short a few points. Now, this final tip I purposely saved for last because this is ultimately a last resort when it comes to getting points. All the other tips that I have provided you with are things that you can do on your own to improve your scores. This one here is if you've reached the end of your rope, you can't find any better paths, and you need to find out exactly how to quote-unquote max out your score. The elite paths is definitely the way to go. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the end of the video. Honestly, I did not expect it to be this long, but we're finally done. Hopefully you can take these tips and utilize them and improve your scores moving forward. If you only take one thing from this video, then that's my job complete. If you want to see more gameplay like this, for Amplitude, Frequency, and a few other rhythm games, check out my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Tuzzlebox. There's also a link in the description. Weekdays I stream late evenings, Eastern Standard Time, and on the weekends I stream in the early to mid-afternoon. I stream everything from Amplitude, Frequency, Clone Hero, and a few other rhythm games, Parappa the Rapper, Guitar Hero, or I said Guitar Hero. Guitar Man is what I meant to say. Yeah. Anyway, I'm out of here. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Tuzzlebox, signing off.